Government spending, this is a lesson taught in every middle school, high school across the country, but for whatever reason, people graduate high school and college, they completely forget this. They're adults and they don't really understand the problems with government spending. Now, this is a theoretical lesson that takes place in a universe where the government is not criminally printing money, where we do not have rampant inflation. I know that sounds like some sort of fantasy. Anyway, so the way that we're going to understand government spending is imagine a swimming pool. Now, imagine that swimming pool filled with money. That is the money supply in the United States or in the world. I know literally we don't have a pool filled with money, but figuratively, this represents the money supply, the dollars available in the United States. It's a finite supply. So we're going to use this as a visual reference to help us understand how much money there is in the economy. So who has access to that pool full of money? The private sector, private businesses, private investors, and the public sector, the government. They each have access to that pool of money. That's the only money that's available in the economy. So visualize this pool full of money, and the private sector and the public sector are fighting over who gets to use the money. If the government spends that money, if the government takes more dollars, then there are fewer dollars available for the private sector. Private businesses, private enterprises, entrepreneurs have less access to liquidity, have less access to cash when the government takes those dollars. So again, envision that pool full of money. Every dollar that the government takes from that pool is a dollar that is not available to the private sector, to private businesses, to small businesses, to consumers. So then you have to ask yourself, who does a better job of spending that money? Does the government do a better job of spending that finite supply? Do they make sure that the money goes to the right businesses? Do they make sure that it goes to the right productions, to the right people? Do they do that? Do they know how to do that? How would they be able to do it? Or does the private sector, is it more efficient? Is it more effective? Is it less wasteful at making sure that you get the best bang for your buck, that you get the best return of value? And we can simply just look at when, over history, the government, the public sector, and the private sector have fought over that pool of money. Who's going to spend it the most effectively? Who's going to spend it the most productively? And you can just see all the different things that the private sector has spent, invented, developed, innovated, all the jobs that they have created. And then you say, well, what has the public sector created? What have you done over 250 years of spending that pool of money? And the results are not that great. It's very clear that the private sector is better at using the money. I'm not going to say they're great. We're not going to say they're perfect. We're not going to say that there isn't corruption in the private sector. We're not going to say that they're angels. But when it comes to efficiency, who do you think should spend that finite supply? Remember, the government can't spend a bunch and the private sector spend a bunch. If the government spends a bunch, which will be over here, and the private sector won't spend, it's teeter-totter, it's a zero-sum game. Who do you want spending? Who's going to be less wasteful? Who creates better products? Who gets better bang for the buck? Who's more productive? It's clearly the private sector. And we have plenty of results. And the reason for that are the incentives. So when we look at private sector spending and we look at public sector spending, the reason why that the private sector is so successful or effective, remember, again, they're not perfect, but they're doing a lot better job than the government. It's because of the incentives. And so if we look at the private sector and we look at the incentives, if they are smart with their money, if they're wise, if they're efficient, they're effective, and they use their money in the right way, they'll make more money. There is an incentive for every small business to be smart. There is an incentive for every corporation to be smart. There is an incentive for every freelance worker, every employee, every laborer to be smart with their resources. And if they are not smart with their resources in the private sector, there is a punishment. You are punished in the private sector if you as an employee, you as a boss, you as a corporation or a small business, if you make bad choices with your resources and are not smart, you go bankrupt. You go out of business. You lose everything you have. So there is, and incentives clearly line up for being smart with money. Now you look at the public sector and say, well, what are the incentives to efficiently, effectively make sure that every dollar is being spent wisely and that it's going to the right parts of the economy? Well, there isn't any incentive. If you run a department or agency and you're very efficient or effective, you're more than likely going to be fired. It sounds crazy, but you want the projects to go over so that you get paid longer. You want to spend extra money so that the employees in the project get paid more. Well, if you go over and you're unwise with your money, then you're all going to, no, nothing changes. You're not rewarded for being smart with public funds, and the government and the public sector, and this is federal, state, and local, they're not punished. It's the same old, same old. And so it's just simple. If you look at the incentives for the private sector are to be wise with your money. The public sector does not have the same incentives, and that's one of the many reasons that public sector spending is inefficient. And so if we're all pulling from the same pool of money, and we're fighting over that money, who should have the money? The private sector, which is more efficient, which is more productive, that allocates the funds into the right parts, or the public sector, which often does not put the money into the right parts of the economy, doesn't do so efficiently, doesn't do so effectively, and doesn't really produce anything in return. Who do you think? So as government spending goes up, public spending goes down, the less we spend, or the private spending, the less that entrepreneurs are innovating, the less private enterprise that's taking place, the less products that will be made. And as supply decreases, price goes up, and then again, you, the consumer, are hurt. Where do you want the money going? There isn't a perfect answer. Obviously, there's going to be some things that the government needs to spend on. That's okay. There is going to be government spending. The real question is, well, how much? And the answer for the most part is not very much at all, because they're just not good at using the resources. They're not effective at using the resources. And there's plenty of examples throughout world history that shows that governments are not better at spending money and allocating resources than the private sector. It's clear without a doubt. If government spending could fix all of our problems, if they could just simply wave a magic wand and spend, and turn this place into Candyland, it would have already happened by now. It wouldn't have just happened in America. It would have happened in all the South American countries where they tried this. It would have happened in all the Eastern European countries where they tried this. It would have happened everywhere where they decided we're just going to spend ourselves out of this problem. We're going to create a utopia. It doesn't work that way. You can't just simply spend money, because every dollar that the government pulls out of the pool is a dollar that's not available to you, private entrepreneur, you, corporation, you, small business owner. The more they spend, the less there is for the private sector. That's a problem. And we've seen this where the economy tanks. Oh, don't worry, we'll just have the government spend the money and that's going to fix the economy. It doesn't work that way. Remember the swimming pool. Every dollar they pull out of the pool is a dollar that's not available to everyone else. That's a dollar that's not available to Walmart or McDonald's or the pizzeria or your mechanic. And guess who hires people more often than not? It's those corporations, it's those small businesses, it's those private firms that are hiring workers for doing something productive and creating. They cannot hire workers. They cannot create, they cannot produce, and they cannot create the goods and services that make our life better when the government is taking all the money out of the pool to chase their dream. It doesn't work. And we're headed right towards this, unfortunately. Government spending is necessary in some cases. As Thomas Paine said, government is a necessary evil. Government spending in some cases is a necessary evil. But we need to limit the government, as Thomas Paine and the Founding Fathers said, and we need to limit and rein in government spending. It's bad news. The more they spend, the less that's available for you. And people say, well, the government creates jobs too. When they spend, they create jobs. No, it doesn't really work that way. Not at all. So let's play this out. When the government spends money to create jobs, we've seen this happen. If they're just spending money, they can just pay people to dig holes, right? If they're just creating jobs and they're just spending money, and you say, well, what's the hole for? Well, the answer is, you just said create a job. That's the problem with government spending. They're not necessarily spending the money to produce anything. They're not spending the money to produce something that's being demanded by the people. They're not necessarily finding a need and serving that need. They're just creating jobs, and we've seen this in China. We've seen this in the Soviet Union, where you just create a job, but the problem is you're wasting resources, and eventually this will catch up to you. So we look again at spending and we look at the pool of money. And another reason why the private sector is so smart, so effective, and produces the result. We talked about the incentives, but we just have to talk about the nature of the spending, why they're spending it, how they're spending it, who they're spending it for. Private enterprises, the pizzeria, the mechanic, the Chinese restaurant, your local grocery store, the car dealership, the automobile factory, you name it. The reason that they exist is because they are serving the customer. They're responsive to the customer. Not only do they have to deal with incentives, over here now, not only does the private sector have to deal with incentives, but they have to be responsive to the customer. If the private sector does not do what the customer wants, they go out of business. So they produce to try to make you happy, and when make you happy, our lives become exponentially better. They work to serve your needs. If they make you happy, they get rich. They are responsive to the customer. The public sector is not. The public sector creates jobs at the direction of a politician, which often is the result of interest groups or their constituency. It's not specifically to serve the economy. It's not specifically designed to allocate resources in the right manner that efficiently produces goods and services that benefits the country. Whereas in the private sector, resources are allocated in a way that's going to produce goods and services that are needed, and the money will flow to where it's needed. If no one wants a anchovy-only pizza restaurant, imagine that. I'm going to open an anchovies-only pizza restaurant, and guess what? No one goes there. You go out of business, and people choose to spend their money at the pizza restaurant where you can get all the toppings you want. Money in the free market, in the private sector, will flow to the best producers and the producers of the goods and services that are demanded. In the public sector, it's up to the politician. And so you'll see the politicians say, we're going to put the money into the anchovy-only pizza place. And if it doesn't work, we'll just keep pumping money into it. It's another reason why if you had to decide right now who should get the money from that swimming pool, who should get the money? Should the private sector have more access to it, or should the government spending have more access to it? The problem that we're staring into from 2021 and 2022 is the government's going to grab a lot of that money, and they're going to inefficiently, ineffectively, and they're going to put the money into things that the consumers do not want. Now, there's going to be the argument that, yeah, but with government spending, we can create equality. Well, I will argue that you're going to do the exact opposite of that, because how does the government spend in the first place? Where did they magically get this money? How do they pull the money from that pool? They get it from you. Now, they either get it from you by taxing you, they tax individuals, which is borderline theft, or simply they take the money from you by preventing you from getting it, by taking it from the pool. They borrow more from the pool so you can borrow less from the pool. So either way you want to slice it, they're taking the money, you're losing the money. And then they take the money and they redistribute it in spending to someone else. How is that equality? To take from someone and give to another person, you are by definition treating the man in the suit unequally. You're not treating that guy equal. You're taking from him and giving him nothing in return, and then you are finding someone else who you're taking nothing from and giving to them. By definition, that is inequality. Is the government treating these two individuals equal? No, they are not. So government spending on its face, first question you realize is that it doesn't create equality. It's based on a process of inequality. And maybe in the end, you create some sort of equality of outcome, but the process is inherently unequal. Are we treating these people equally? Is the function of government spending treating these two individuals equally? It is not. It's treating one more equally than the other. That is one of the main problems with government spending, plus the fact that they're just wasteful of money because their incentives don't line up and they're not responsive to the customer. So remember that swimming pool. When you can visualize a swimming pool and that there's only so much money, there's a finite supply, you'll realize that maybe the government shouldn't take too much of that because it's going to slow down the private sector. It's going to prevent innovation. It's going to prevent entrepreneurship. It's going to prevent economic growth. And we're just going to light money on fire. Not to say that government spending is bad. Don't get me wrong. Necessary evil. Sometimes you have to do it, but you have to live in it. You have to constrain it. You have to rein it in.